Child molestation and allegations of misconduct. We're learning children are not immune to these crimes, even when it comes to people parents think they can trust. Police arrested 20-year-old Lance Hayda on charges he allegedly molested a 1-year-old in his care.
Think of a child. Maybe your own child. Or maybe it's a child you see regularly. Your niece, your grandchild. I'll bet the first thing that comes to mind is innocence and sweetness. Now imagine that child abused. There is a cruel reality for those who are abused. Never really fitting in. Never able to trust. Feeling guilty. Sad. Scared. In agony. The facts are staggering. Studies show that as many as 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 7 boys will be sexually abused at some point in their childhood. In as many as 93% of child sexual cases, the child knows the person that commits the abuse. Kids are vulnerable at any age. Sadly, 88% of cases of sexual abuse are never reported to the authorities. Many victims will not report their case of child sexual abuse until they're over 30 years old, allowing the perpetrator to continue their reign of terror on many children and for many years. The convicted serial child sex offender will abuse on average 117 victims, and some have abused 380 children before being caught and convicted. What does a child sex offender look like? Anyone. This is any person of any age, of any economic standing, of any religion or race. Sex offenders can be male or female, but criminal statistics show they're more likely to be a Caucasian male in his mid-30s. Women are capable of perpetrating sexual abuse as well. In fact, millions of children are sexually abused by women each year. In many cases, though, if a woman is involved in child sexual abuse, they usually want to teach a youngster about sex, or they're cooperating with a male aggressor.
I interviewed hundreds of them, and if I had met them on the street, many of them I would think that they're the nicest people I've ever met. They're chameleons. They are, I often call them wolves in sheep's clothing.
Child sex offenders often disguise themselves as harmless and caring people. They usually place themselves in a leadership role as clergy, a coach, youth group leader, teacher, mentor, babysitter, camp counselor, Sunday school teacher, music leader, youth minister. Most importantly, these predators have the ability to create a sense of trust with both the child and their parents, and are crafty at luring children into situations that may allow the offender to abuse the child. He may use affection, bribery, fun and games, drugs or alcohol, or threats to lure a child into a compromising situation. Child sexual abusers, in fact, can be children themselves. While usually the child offender is older and more powerful in thought or maturity, he or she can still be under the age of 18. In this type of abuse, no adults are around during the act. However, research shows that more than half of these child perpetrators themselves have been sexually victimized by 2 or more adults. Juveniles are responsible for abusing 40% of victims under the age of 6. As staff and volunteers working with kids, we strive to offer teaching, kindness, and protection for children. Tragically, youth-serving organizations have not always been safe places for kids. Child sexual abuse, physical abuse, exploitation, and ritual abuse occur in churches, youth sports, and in any group that works with kids. It's hard to imagine, but it happens everywhere. We don't like to think that any person in our organization would harm a child, but it's that belief that attracts the perpetrator to you. Also, youth-serving organizations provide opportunities for close contact and for close personal relationships with children, which is wonderful for healthy adults. But for an abuser, this is just the place where he will easily find his next victim or victims. It's hard to imagine, but it happens everywhere. Youth-serving organizations provide opportunities for close contact with kids.
Keeping kids safe is every adult's responsibility. You're watching this video so that you can recognize abuse. You can recognize the abuser, and you will know what to do, who to call, how to react. Safeguarding children from abuse is in your hands. Don't turn away. Don't be embarrassed. Don't think, oh, that doesn't happen here. And don't be afraid to blow the whistle on anyone. Anyone. It's time to take action.
Part 1. Types of child abuse and zero tolerance policy. Two things will detract the abuser from your organization: education of staff and a zero tolerance policy. There must be a core knowledge about how to recognize abuse, how to report potential abuse, and we must be informed about how to safely carry out our jobs without providing opportunities for abusers to harm the children while in our care. Dr. Lee Baker, clinical psychologist and director of the Trauma Treatment Center of Colorado.
We as adults in position of trust with children have to arm ourselves with this knowledge. It's critical that we do and that we understand that. And that, I think, is major in the prevention of sexual abuse. In the 26 years that I've been practicing, at least 50% of the cases could have been prevented if people know and have this knowledge.
There are basically four types of abuse. Abuse is any physical injury. Sexual abuse, neglect or emotional abuse inflicted on a child other than by accidental means, by those responsible for the child's care, custody, and control. Discipline administered in a reasonable manner would not be construed to be abuse. Dr. Lisa Spector, pediatrician and child abuse specialist at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri.
In terms of physical injury to a child, it doesn't matter whether or not the parent or caregiver intended to cause injury to the child or harm to that child. Typically, physical discipline is not considered child abuse, assuming that it's done in a reasonable manner and does not cause any bodily injury to a child as well.
Physical abuse is the infliction of an injury by another person, when a person deliberately and intentionally causes bodily harm to a child, usually through an aggressive act. Examples may include violent battery with a weapon, such as a knife, belt, or strap.
Kids who suffer from abdominal trauma typically don't have any outward physical signs of abuse. They may have symptoms from the abdominal trauma like vomiting or abdominal pain, but a lot of times it goes unnoticed or is diagnosed as something else. The younger children who suffer from abusive head trauma also may not have outward signs of abuse, but may have more physical symptoms like vomiting or headaches.
The abuser may shake, kick, burn, choke, bruise, or even break the bones of a child in a non-accidental manner.
Physical abuse can be pattern injuries on child's bodies. So pattern injuries because somebody was hit with an object, like an extension cord, for example, or a paddle. It also can be a pattern injury if they were burned with something. I've also seen a kid who had Con Air burned into the back of their back because the parent or caregiver had put a hot iron on that child's back to teach them a lesson. If you have burns or bruises on different parts of your bodies that are not over bony prominences are also concerning too. So kids who have bruises on the inside part of their arm, on the inside part of their legs.
Sexual abuse of a child is any sexual act between an adult and a child, including penetration, intercourse, incest, rape, oral sex, and sodomy. Sexual abuse of a child refers to the sexual behavior between an adult and child, or between two children, one of whom is forcefully dominant or significantly older. The U.S. Department of Justice estimates that 1 in 6 victims of sexual assault is under the age of 12. Despite publicly surrounding cases where a child is assaulted by a stranger, almost all sexual assaults against children are perpetrated by a family member, a friend, or a trusted child caregiver.
Child sexual abuse also may involve fellatio, sodomy, or any penetrative sexual intercourse between an adult and a child. It may involve sexual exploitation through prostitution or creation or production of pornography. It also may involve violation of bodily privacy in terms of watching a child undress or forcing a child to expose their genitalia, as well as sexual exposure or exposure to sex, so forcing a child to look at somebody else's private parts, whether that's in a video or a photo format.
Other examples of abuse include fondling, touching or kissing a child's genitals, making a child fondle or kiss an adult's genitals whether dressed or undressed, violations of bodily privacy, forcing a child to undress, spying on a child in the locker room, bathroom, or bedroom, exposing children to adult sexuality, performing sexual acts in front of a child, exposing genitals, telling dirty stories, or showing pornography to a child. Photographing, videotaping, or filming of children with the intent to create sexual stimulation is a form of child abuse. Exposing a child to erotic material in the form of live behavior such as excessive nudity, photographs, film, internet, or video. The collection of any photographs or images of children taken by others in suggestive poses is abuse. Sexual exploitation through child prostitution or child pornography for commercial management. Detective Sean Krantz, Douglas County Specials Unit, Internet Crimes Against Children.
A lot of children who are abused sexually don't even realize they're being abused sexually. They have grown up with it, a lot of them. It's how they've been taught that that's how you show love. And so it's not something that's wrong, dirty, or abnormal. And they don't really realize that they're a victim.
There's one particular case of a young girl, and I can't remember exactly how old she was, maybe around 10 or 12 years of age, that we saw here at the SCAN clinic for sexual abuse concerns. And she had disclosed previously to my evaluation of her that her stepbrother had sexually abused her while living in her mom's home. And after she made that disclosure, a lot of things in her family changed. She wasn't able to be involved with her mother's side of the family anymore after the disclosure because they weren't able to remove the perpetrators at the time. So she ended up recanting. So she said, I lied, it didn't happen, I wasn't sexually abused. Because understandably, as many kids do who've been sexually abused or have any other type of maltreatment, whether it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, or neglect, they frequently will recant their story because they realize once they made this disclosure, everything has changed for them. They're now maybe perhaps living in foster care, or now perhaps everybody is talking about it in the family, and there's a lot of arguments, whether they're verbal or physical altercations among maybe perhaps adults in the family. And maybe they're going to a different school now, and they're not able to hang out with their friends, or they're not able to even see the perpetrator, perhaps makes them upset as well, depending upon who that perpetrator is and the kind of relationship they had with that child. For example, if it's an adult, or in this case, a brother that they were somewhat close with, that it's difficult, those changes, and sometimes kids just want to make it go away by saying, you know what, I made that up, when really they didn't.
Neglect is the failure to provide the proper and necessary support and education, nutrition, and medical, surgical, or any other care necessary for the child's well-being as required by law. Neglect is when a person endangers a child's health, safety, or welfare through negligence.
So neglect can take many forms, including physical neglect, medical neglect, emotional neglect, and educational neglect. Physical neglect involves not providing for that child's food and shelter and clothing, as well as supervisory neglect is included in that as well. Medical neglect involves not providing for the child's medical or mental health care needs. Educational neglect involves not providing education for that child or attaining special needs if that child requires or needs special educational needs.
Categories of neglect. Physical neglect is when the caregiver fails to provide basic physical necessities such as safe, clean, and adequate clothing, housing, food, and healthcare. Environmental neglect is characterized by the caregiver's failure to ensure environmental safety, opportunities, and resources for the child. Emotional or psychological neglect is when the caregiver doesn't offer love, nurturance, encouragement, or support. Educational neglect is distinguished by a caregiver's failure to provide appropriate educational opportunities. Emotional abuse may also be referred to as emotional maltreatment, psychological maltreatment, or psychological abuse. This type of abuse is when a person exposes a child to spoken and/or unspoken violence or emotional cruelty through verbal or symbolic acts. Emotional abuse sends a message that a child is worthless, bad, or insignificant. Kids exposed to this type of abuse may be deprived of parental affection, being constantly told they're terrible or stupid. These children may be forced into closets or small spaces for long durations of time. They may also be given or forced to consume alcohol or drugs.
Child neglect is probably the most prevalent. It is the most prevalent form of child maltreatment. It's theorized that emotional maltreatment or emotional abuse is pretty prevalent as well, but it's very difficult to identify and to prove that it's going on, although it's very damaging to children when they're subjected to emotional abuse.
Emotional abuse is difficult to prove but is extremely devastating to the victim. Emotional maltreatment typically takes 5 main behavioral forms. Rejecting is when the adult refuses to acknowledge the child's worth and the legitimacy of the child's needs. Isolating is when the adult cuts off the child from normal social experiences, prevents the child from forming healthy friendships, and makes the child believe that he or she is alone in the world. Terrorizing. The adult verbally assaults the child, creates a climate of fear, bullies and frightens the child, and makes the child believe that the world is unpredictable and hostile. Ignoring is when the adult deprives the child of essential motivation and responsiveness, stifling emotional growth and intellectual development in the most extreme sense. Corrupting is when the adult motivates the child to engage in destructive, antisocial behavior, reinforces that rebelliousness, and makes the child unfit for normal social experiences. The earlier the abuse is caught, the better the chance of recovery and appropriate treatment for the child. Remember, abuse can happen anywhere in your organization. If a child reports that he or she has experienced the behaviors detailed in these descriptions, serious attention should be paid to the report. Abuse can occur in any organization that serves children. Kids are the most defenseless members of our society, so pay attention and take immediate action. Many organizations and schools have adopted zero-tolerance rules when it comes to child abuse. Zero-tolerance policy is a swift crackdown on a crime or undesirable behavior, implemented with harsh punishment even for first-time offenders, regardless of accidental mistakes, ignorance, or extenuating circumstances.
Given that most child abuse is perpetrated by people who are well known to the child, family members, friends, most child abuse happens in everyday areas. So in the home, and in the neighbor's home, in a friend's home, in a relative's home, at school, at church, in the supermarket.
Safeguard from Abuse will help you identify child abuse. Please answer the following questions in your head. The answer will reveal itself. Question number 1. What are the 2 actions that will detract the abuser from your organization? A. No cell phone use and no overnight trips. B. Education of staff and a zero-tolerance policy. C. No pocket knives and wearing only organization logo t-shirts. 2. What's the most common form of child abuse? A. Neglect. B. Sexual abuse. C. Physical abuse. 3. This type of abuse is when a person exposes a child to spoken and or unspoken violence or emotional cruelty through verbal or symbolic acts. This type of abuse sends a message that the child is worthless, bad, or insignificant. What type of abuse is this? A. Sexual abuse. B. Physical abuse. C. Emotional abuse. Continue on to the next part of the video to learn more. End of part 1. Part 2. 9 of the most common characteristics of a predator, and lures and ways a child sexual predator finds and grooms their next victim.
They look like me. They look like my husband. They look like my boss. They look like your minister. I have personally arrested people who were actually technically rocket scientists working for the government. I have arrested soldiers coming back from Afghanistan. I have arrested the typical view of what a pedophile looks like, the dirty, grungy, boogeyman looking type. They look like anybody.
It's not easy to identify adults who sexually abuse children. Sometimes offenders are married, sometimes they're single, some professional and some retired. Pedophilia is a sickness that knows no bounds, and offenders infiltrate every segment of society. While there's no single personality profile that fits perfectly, criminologists and psychologists will tell you that there are many common factors found. All sexual predators are similar in some aspects, From this, the basic profile and characteristics list is created. A need for power and control. Many abusers were abused themselves. This brings a whole list of emotional problems, including a deep sense of helplessness. Feeling in control for an abuser is paramount. Achieving control over a child is easy for an adult. Adults are bigger, stronger, and have intellectual maturity. Sexual behavior between an adult and a child is an obvious mistreatment of power. Offenders act out of reaction to low self-esteem. They use their violent actions to exercise control and power to enhance their own self-image, to feel powerful, and to dominate others. Dr. Lee Baker.
Sexual predators do share some common traits. So let's look at a few. One is a sense of entitlement, that the world is theirs for the taking, and that they are exempt from the normal rules that govern other people. They're different. They have a sense of entitlement.
A sense of entitlement. Many abusers hold this attitude in the most extreme sense and believe that the world owes them, and they want to collect now. They always want more. Whatever you do is never good enough for them. They'll always generally show no gratitude. These people feel that it's their privilege or right to abuse a child. One of the biggest indicators of sexual predators is a sense of entitlement or pompous sense of self. People with narcissistic behavior have a false sense of power that allows them to break the rules of society, believing that the laws do not apply to them, and they don't feel remorse when they get caught. Low self-esteem. Intimacy can be difficult, even impossible, for those with low self-esteem. Because of this lack of intimacy, a person can become either aggressive toward others or completely distant and detached. Those with severe low self-esteem are rigid, domineering when given the chance, and isolated. The feelings of insecurity make him extremely defensive.
A low self-esteem. We find that many of these sexual predators really don't feel very good about themselves inside. They don't feel very healthy because many of them come from troubled childhoods. And you have to understand that children who are sexually abused, a majority of them do not go on to sexually abuse other children as adults. However, of the population of sexual abusers, majority of them, almost 90% of them, have been abused in their own childhood. So they have a very troubled childhood.
They look for relationships in which they feel empowered and in control, which is one of the main driving forces behind abuse and molestation. It can be difficult to spot a person with low self-esteem as they generally put on a happy facade to deflect questions or suspicion. Lack of empathy. This is someone who's unable to imagine oneself in another's place and understand the other's feelings, desires, ideas, and actions. This causes the abuser to create rationalizations as to why he abuses a child. The child wanted sex. The child needed to be hit. The child should be blamed and shamed. They actually believe that the child or others did something to warrant being screamed at, demeaned, humiliated, and made to feel physically or emotionally powerless. Lack of empathy allows them to justify otherwise unjustifiable treatment of those around him or those he lures into his life.
How can someone sexually abuse a child? And when you look at these characteristics, you begin to understand how they rationalize this behavior. An important thing is they have a lack of empathy for their victims. Because if you really understood what this was going to do to a child, you would not sexually abuse them. They have a lack of empathy because they focus on themselves and their own needs, and it's an inability to really place themselves in somebody else's shoes. And we find that that's a very important characteristic that they share.
Refusal to take responsibility for his or her actions and blames others or circumstances for failures. Ironically, those who abuse children usually define themselves as victims. Many abusers blame a terrible childhood, betrayal by a loved one, unfair society, or any other excuse that can help them avoid responsibility. These individuals blame others for the consequences that resulted from their own actions. Sexual abusers will even go to the extreme that his victims were aroused and enjoyed the sex games he played with them, again, avoiding accountability. The typical sexual predator is very immature in his or her understanding of intimacy. It's like they truly want closeness, but they lack the skills to feel fulfillment and trust. The inability to accept responsibility for actions and behaviors is a result of insecurity. By accepting responsibility, one feels they're admitting to being weak, powerless, or defenseless. It may cause one to feel they will lose their sense of value and importance, two qualities an abuser craves.
They blame others for their unfortunate circumstances. It's always someone else's fault. It's always the child that perhaps engaged them in this behavior, or the young adolescent that was sexually seductive with them. So it has to do with blaming others and not really taking full responsibility for their actions.
The narcissistic abuser is often found in high positions and in positions of trust, giving them a sense of importance. They can be charming, outgoing, and well-liked. They feed on the admiration of others. Children love them and give them tremendous pleasure and fulfillment, and this unfortunately renders them prey to the narcissist's self-gratification. A history of abuse and/or a troubled childhood. Child abuse is a problem that's centuries old. This problem is not just characteristic of the 20th century. As early as 1884, Great Britain founded the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children in an effort to protect children from brutal treatment. The first state in the United States to legislate protection for children was New York. Through the years, other states passed such laws. In the early 1960s, child abuse was identified as an observable, clinical condition, which could be a serious threat to a child's life. Most perpetrators have experienced some sort of childhood abuse themselves, and unfortunately, they've never processed this childhood conflict. He or she may have been abused or witnessed abuse at the hands or words of a parent. Typically, the abuser repeats the intergenerational cycle of trauma, projecting his rage and anger on those he supposedly values. Sadly, about 30% of abused and neglected children will later abuse their own children, continuing the horrible cycle of abuse. And about 80% of 21-year-olds who were abused as children could be diagnosed with at least one psychological disorder. Deviant sexual behavior and thoughts. This profiles a person who has sexual perversion or deviation, a condition in which the sexual instinct is expressed in ways that are socially prohibited or unacceptable or are biologically undesirable, such as the use of a non-human object for sexual arousal, sexual activity with another person that involves real or simulated suffering or humiliation, or sexual relations with a non-consenting partner. It appears that deviant sexual arousal is a factor in abnormal sexual behavior, mostly in the case of pedophiles. A history of antisocial behaviors, prior arrests, and unsteady work history. Those who have a lack of consideration for others and who may cause damage to society, whether intentionally or through negligence, are considered antisocial. These individuals often have a history of breaking the law. Although they may not be convicted felons, they believe that they're exempt from the rules that govern everyday life, and usually have had an unsteady employment history, a history of cheating on taxes, avoiding child support payments, and using lawsuits as a way of resolving conflict. This person will use any means to get what he or she desires and has very little remorse for the actions that cause others pain. So this type of perpetrator will choose children as a means for sexual gratification simply because they're easy targets. Drug and/or alcohol abuse. Substance abuse or dependence is when an individual persists in the use of alcohol or other drugs despite problems. Compulsive and repetitive use may result in tolerances to the effect of the drug, and some may use them to cope with emotions and situations in an abusive way. For pedophiles, sexual fantasies, feelings, urges, or behaviors towards children will become enhanced and they'll most likely satisfy their urges when intoxicated.
You can have all of those characteristics and not be a sexual predator. However, sexual predators do share some common traits.
Lures and ways a sexual predator finds and grooms their next victim.
They often find jobs that put them near children, for instance, or adolescents, for instance, coaches, teachers, youth group leaders, people who are in positions of trust, clergy are often found in this population. But the predator will become friendly even with the parents and with the neighborhood so that he gains the trust of everyone around him or her, and therefore gains access to the children.
It really does draw that child away from their family, their friends, because they become their best friend. They listen, they never have a coarse word, they never disagree with them. They gain trust, and that's something that is very ill-perceived with the children, trust, because a lot of them can't even fathom some of the things that can happen to them.
Common strategies to get close to children include befriending parents, particularly single parents, to gain access to their children, offering babysitting services to overextended parents, taking jobs and participating in community events that involve children, offering to coach children's sports, volunteering in youth organizations, offering to chaperone overnight trips, loitering around playgrounds, malls, game arcades, etc., spending time in internet gaming and social networking sites, learning the online interests and lingo of youngsters.
Sexual abuse occurs in stages. Therefore, if you understand the stages of sexual abuse, you can prevent sexual abuse from happening because you will stop this, process from happening. In most cases, it is a process. First step is identification. A predator will have access to children, and he or she will identify which child is the most vulnerable, which child will keep a secret, which child is the most compliant, which child perhaps is the most needy, a child whose parents have just gone through a divorce, a child who has lost a pet, who has lost something important, is unpopular at school. These children might be very vulnerable, and therefore the predator is detecting at this stage which children are vulnerable. Then the predator approaches, and there's always a soft approach, such as becoming a friend to the child, giving the child compliments. It's very benign at first, but it is an approach. They're testing out how far they can go with this child. And then you get into the process of grooming, where they will have a secret relationship with the child that is isolated from their peers and their parents. It's very important that the predator begin to isolate the child, do special things with the child. The swim coach who will pick up a child early in the morning because the child has talent and wants to give special swimming lessons. The youth group leader who takes the child out for lunch or breakfast and really begins to talk to the child, beginning to isolate the child. And also maintaining secrecy. Can the child, this is just between you and I, this is just between us, this is our special relationship. And they begin to set these up, set this scene up for the final act of sexual abuse. And they also will begin to touch the child in places such as beginning with hugs, pats on the buttocks, beginning to touch to see how the child reacts to the touch. So it happens slowly and in the context of that grooming. And it's very important that people understand the grooming process because you do see it way before the sexual act will be committed. A predator will bestow the child with incredible significance. They often say, you're so intelligent, you're so smart, you're like an adult, we can be friends. So they bestow the child with intelligence. They will bestow the child with compliments. You're so beautiful, you're so special, you're so smart, you're such a great athlete. And they also will give presents, special favors, special treats, even gifts, collecting gifts, which is an important sign. If a child is receiving something and keeping it secret, or even if they're not keeping it secret, that is a warning sign, because the predator is, rewarding the child for engaging in this inappropriate relationship with them.
They make them feel special. They, in some cases, send them gifts. And a lot of parents don't realize that gifts don't have to come in the mail or be dropped off on the front porch. You can send gifts electronically. You can send credits electronically to buy iTunes and apps on, your devices and things like that. So that's all incorporated in that grooming process of gaining the child's trust. And when they set up a meet, it really doesn't cross the child's mind that there's danger involved. So they typically don't tell anyone they're going to meet them. They sneak out oftentimes. They will leave like they're going to school and never go to school. They will lie and say they're going to a friend's house. They will be dropped off at the mall and the predator will be at the mall. You know, sometimes we've also had predators who will do a couple of meets and eventually take the child. So it's not something that happens on the first meet. So the child feels absolutely safe when they go to meet this person. It's not the boogeyman at that point. It's my best friend, or the person who wants to take care of me, or the person that I want to marry. You know, there's so many different dynamics depending on what child is being groomed and what purposes the child is being groomed for.
Test your knowledge. 1. What does a child sex offender look like? A. A man in his late 20s. B. A man who drives an ice cream truck. C. Anyone. 2. What percentage of abused children will later abuse their own children? A. 30%. B. 40%. C. 60%. 3. What are some common strategies that pedophiles use to get close to children? A. Offering babysitting services to overextended parents. B. Taking jobs and participating in community events that involve children. C. Both A and B. Continue on to the next part of the video to learn more. End of part 2. Part 3. Behaviors and signs of an abused child. Appropriate and inappropriate touch in female predators.
Kids who've been sexually or physically abused and or neglected, any part of child maltreatment, kids can have a whole wide variety of symptoms that they exhibit, from having absolutely no symptoms at all to having symptoms that are externalizing, and we think of those as being aggressive or bullying other children, being involved in theft or vandalism as well, to internalizing symptoms where kids are depressed or they're anxious or they're socially withdrawn or they're inflicting injury onto their own body as well.
Most kids find it difficult to talk about abuse, especially boys. The first step in helping abused or neglected children is learning to recognize the signs of child abuse and neglect. The presence of a single sign does not prove that child abuse is occurring, but a closer look at the situation may be warranted when these signs appear repeatedly or in combination. A child may be subjected to a combination of different kinds of abuse, and it is also possible that a child may show no outward signs and hide what is happening from everyone.
When a child has been abused, it creates significant disruption in the child's emotional and cognitive development. And the implications are far-reaching into adulthood. There is a higher level of depression, other psychological disorders, substance abuse, antisocial behavior, and significant problems in relationships. The child's trust in the world has been destroyed. And so therefore, the child does not see the world as a safe and trusting place.
Children who are physically abused may be nervous around adults, be watchful as though preparing for something bad to happen, have unexplained recurrent injuries or burns, have difficulty playing, act aggressively toward adults and other children, be unable to concentrate at school, suddenly underachieve or overachieve at school, refusal to undress for gym, self-destructive tendencies, find it difficult to trust other people and make friends, arrive at school too early or leave after the other children have left, fear that suspected abuser being contacted.
So we're seeing more and more of child-on-child sexual abuse these days. There's lots of different thoughts as to why that might be the case. When kids have experienced maltreatment themselves, it involves a loss of control for that child. Somebody has kind of taken that power and control away from that child. And one of the theories is that in order to get that power and control back, they then do it to somebody else. But another part of that may be that when something like this happens to a child and they're trying to figure it out, they're trying to understand, what is this, why did it happen, what is this all about? And part of that then perpetrating on another child is them kind of trying to figure out what it was that happened to them through doing it to somebody else, unfortunately.
Children who are sexually abused may behave differently when abuse starts, care less about their appearance and or health, talk or act sexually at too early an age, suddenly draw sexually explicit pictures, be secretive and stop talking about their home lives, start soiling themselves, be unable to sleep, suddenly find physical contact frightening, run away from home, have medical problems such as chronic itching, pain in the genitals, or venereal diseases, have other extreme reactions such as depression, self-mutilation, suicide attempts, running away, overdoses, or anorexia.
It's important to understand normal childhood sexual development, to understand what is appropriate and what isn't. And normal sexual play does occur between children even as young as 2, 3, 4, when they're beginning to explore their bodies. Sexuality is something that develops from infancy to adulthood. And when a child is sexually abused, the thermostat on that development is turned completely up, and a child is catapulted into adult sexuality, and they're having to deal with it. So let's take an example here. We'll go beyond the normal sex play, because the normal sex play happens, and it could be secret, but it happens, it's funny, it's giggly, it happens between children of the same age, often of the same sex, and it doesn't predominate the child's play. It happens here and there. But when you have children perpetrating on other children, the perpetrator, the child perpetrator, is exposing that child to either sexuality that is way beyond what they would normally know, and therefore the child is overwhelmed by the sexuality.
Clearly it looks like the girls are more sexually abused than boys. There's some concerns that perhaps boys are just not reporting sexual abuse as much as girls, especially in our society. If a boy is sexually abused, particularly by a woman, sometimes people perceive that to be different and not necessarily sexual abuse. And if a boy is sexually abused by another male, then that boy sometimes has feelings of, does that make me a homosexual because I've been sexually abused by another male? And that's sometimes very difficult for kids to resolve or process through, and it makes it even harder for them to disclose the child's sexual abuse.
Children who are emotionally abused may have difficulty learning to talk or will suddenly not be able to speak up, find it hard to develop close relationships, be overly friendly with strangers, be unable to play imaginatively, think badly of themselves, overreact to mistakes, underachieve at school, have extreme fear of any new situation, have neurotic behavior such as rocking, hair twisting, or self-mutilation.
And the most important thing that I could impart to teachers or coaches in terms of how to recognize somebody who might be abused or neglected is to see if there's any change in that child's mood or behavior that warrants someone to have a conversation with them or to increase their awareness that maybe something's going on for that child. And it might not be abuse or neglect, but in the unfortunate circumstance that it is, it's important to recognize.
Children who are neglected may be constantly hungry, even emaciated, is constantly tired, has a poor state of clothing, untreated medical problems, no social relationships, compulsive scavenging, destructive tendencies.
Unless you teach them what to do when that happens, then you're only giving them half of the information if you only tell them that this shouldn't happen. You need to give them that part of what do you do when this happens. You can say no, and go and tell somebody, or leave the room, and it's okay if it does happen to tell them that piece as well, but to make sure that you come and tell somebody after that does happen and feel comfortable. And finding a variety of people that child feels comfortable to tell, because a lot of times they will not tell their parent. It's the teacher or it's the coach or it's somebody else that they know can handle that information.
Appropriate and inappropriate touch and behaviors. Most formal child caretakers, clergy, and coaches have been formally trained in the skill of appropriate and inappropriate touch. But what about the volunteer or helper? What separates an innocent hug from an aggressive grab? What about a kiss on the cheek, pulling a girl's ponytail, or a pat on the bottom after a slam dunk or a touchdown? What about when a first grader wants to hold your hand while on a field trip?
We have had people very, very respected and held in very high regard in the community that submerge themselves in youthful activities so that they can have a larger victim pool.
For most adults, we know that showering naked with other people's kids is just absolutely wrong. But what if a child wants to hug you? This is okay as long as you don't prolong the hug or touch the child in any areas that a bathing suit would cover. Hugging may be appropriate and positive in some circumstances, but it can also be inappropriate if the child is not responsive, if the employee or volunteer is hugging too often or for too long, if the contact is romanticized or sexually intimate.
I interviewed a man who had sexually abused an 11-year-old. And in his mind, he rationalized the abuse and saw it as a positive thing for the young girl because they had a relationship. He did not see it, not couch it in terms of abuse. So he had a lack of empathy for this child. He felt a sense of entitlement that he can, do these acts and it's okay, and a very disturbed sense of what relationships really are. The sexual predator often has a very distorted view of relationships. They also, an important part, is have a very high need for power and control. And often the sexual act in itself may not be sexually satisfying, but it's an expression of power and control.
Because we're sometimes unsure what appropriate behavior with kids is. We're uncertain when abuse is really happening or not. For most of us, we have a social understanding of right and wrong touch, but it's hard to know all the time what's definitely appropriate with children. Here are some guidelines and good practices. The top 10 nevers. 1. Never tickle children. It's overstimulating and is considered to be a deceptive device that may lead to more inappropriate touching, such as fondling. 2. Never engage in rough, physical, or sexually provocative games, including horseplay. 3. Never allow or engage in inappropriate touching of any form. 4. Never allow a child to stand between your legs when seated. Gently guide the child to your side. You may still speak eye to eye and comfort the child, or talk quietly with them at your side. 5. Never hold school-age children and older children on your lap. Holding a preschooler or toddler on your lap is appropriate for short time spans when comfort is needed. 6. Never allow children to use inappropriate language or make sexually suggestive comments to a child, even in fun. 7. Never show pornography or involve youth in pornographic activities or photographs. 8. Never let them out of your view. All activities and practices should be scheduled so that all children are within your sight at all times. 9. Never kiss a child on your lips. Never let a child kiss you on the lips. This is especially important to remember if you're working with or coaching an older team of the opposite sex. Don't let the excitement of the moment allow you to lose your senses or permit a youth with a crush to lose theirs. 10. Never let allegations a child makes go unchallenged or unrecorded. Always act promptly.
The predator will normalize inappropriate behaviors. Oh, we do it to everyone. We pat them on the back. We give the adolescent girls a big hug. Okay, we throw them in the pool. We wrestle with them. He or she will normalize these behaviors.
Female predators. No one thinks a woman can be a sexual predator. However, it does happen. It's not as prevalent as male sexual predators, but it can occur. In fact, millions of children are sexually abused by women each year. Like male predators, there seems to be no defined demographic. Female predators can be teachers, coaches, tutors, youth group leaders, moms, and grandmothers.
Unfortunately, there are people in positions of trust with our children who violate that trust.
They represent only 1% of all adults incarcerated for sex offenses and 2% of all females in prison. Some have only one victim. Many have several. These women usually initiated the activity, taking advantage of boys or girls who were sexually stimulated, flavoring their crime with a romantic tone. When interviewed, most female predators said they felt sorry for the youngster and wanted to help or teach them about sex. In most cases, there was no violence involved. Some of them say, and the children were willing to engage in sexual activity with them. Most female sexual predators are immature, dependent, and sensitive to rejection, so they tend to gravitate toward younger people. The risk of rejection is less likely, and they create situations in which they can be in control. The other type of female sexual predator is one that's cooperating with a male aggressor. She's considered a reluctant partner. These are women typically in long-term relationships who go along with sexual exploitation of a minor out of fear of being abandoned by her partner or of being physically abused herself.
In our society, the thought of a woman sexually abusing a child is horrific. We are in a position of caring for children. Women are maternal. They are nurturing. So the thought of a woman sexually abusing a child, an adolescent, is horrific to us. It's difficult for us to conceive of. However, in my research and in my work with 26 years with children, I have seen many cases where a female has abused a child. More often it occurs with a woman who is in a relationship with perhaps even a child as young as 11. Sexual predators, female sexual predators, often couch the sexual abuse in terms of a relationship and that they love the child and the child is so mature. And that in that context. However, there are other incidents and other cases that I have dealt with. For instance, a young boy who was sexually abused by his camp counselor. He was away at camp, and his female camp counselor sexually abused him. So females do sexually abuse children, and they should be part of the background check.
Please answer the following questions in your head. The answer will reveal itself. Question number 1. Studies show us that how many girls and boys will be sexually abused at some point in their childhood? A. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 7 boys. B. 1 in 8 girls and 1 in 12 boys. C. 10% of girls and 50% of boys. Two. While working or volunteering with kids, what should you never do? A. Never give comfort when one of the kids has fallen and scraped his or her knee. B. Never engage in rough, physical, or sexually provocative games, including horseplay. C. Never hold a preschooler or toddler on your lap for short time spans when comfort is needed. Three. Can a mother be a sexual predator as well? A. Yes. B. No. Continue on to the next part of the video to learn more. End of part 3. Part 4. Social media, sleepaway camps, and what to do if you suspect abuse.
You want to look for just awkward behaviors in that individual. Do they show a different or severe interest in children? Do they act suspiciously when you come around the corner and the computer's up? Do they automatically close the screen or that sort of thing? And you'd be surprised at what people are hiding. It very much is a private crime in that it's not something you brag about to your buddies. It's not, you know, every time I arrest somebody, if they're married, I go to the wife and I ask him, has he ever shown an interest in children? No. Have you ever seen child pornography on your computer? No. He would never do this. You're wrong.
In the virtual world, the definition of a student-teacher, student-coach, or student-mentor relationship is hazy, particularly on social networks like Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, YouTube, Flickr, and multi-user chat rooms, where adults and teens share the same forums to connect and keep in touch with friends, classmates, relatives, and coworkers. Based on current research, teens flock to Facebook because it's mainly a parent-free space. Therefore, it's an easy place for predators to access kids without their parents' knowledge. Make sure that you know your organization's policy regarding social networking with kids. Most experts recommend discouraging teachers and students from communicating exclusively without a parent guardian, or school administrator being able to access the message.
Federal laws against people producing, sharing, distributing child porn, and included in that is having children view internet pornography or producing pornography that's then shared on the internet involving a child.
Group activities and sleepaway camps. Some activities such as evening meetings or practices, one-on-one mentoring, overnight trips, bathing, changing, bathroom interactions, and nighttime activities pose greater risks for child sexual abuse.
The less background work you do on somebody, the less requirements you have, the more likely you are to get some of these people in your organization or in your midst, so to speak.
Here are some helpful tips. Keep reasonable hours. Teachers, mentors, and coaches should never meet kids after 9 p.m. at night and should avoid scheduling meetings that cause kids to return home late on a school night. Meeting groups. Always arrange for meetings as a team or in small groups rather than one-on-one adult with a child.
And our goal here is to make sure that these predators do not go hands-on with the child.
Stick to public places. Hold all meetings at public places. Examples of good meeting spots include public parks, coffee shops, restaurants, and libraries. You should never meet one-on-one in a private location such as a home, apartment, or private office. Maintain other safeguards such as extra supervision and tighter management when dealing with sensitive youth activities. A supervised, safe, and fun environment is the goal. That means strict rules that are adhered to at all times.
Instituting good rules and boundaries about what is appropriate, what's not appropriate, having curfews for those children in terms of showering, if they're going to shower at the sleepaway camp.
Background check on all staff and volunteers.
I use the drug analogy. It's not like using marijuana as a gateway drug to heroin. You don't rob banks as a gateway drug to child pornography. You either are attracted to children or you're not. And typically they're law-abiding citizens. In mine, 9 years, I've arrested 3 people who had prior child pornography charges. So that's not a huge number.
Educate in both formal training sessions and in informal settings, such as constructive conversations. Always meet in groups. Will the campers be taken off campus for day or overnight trips? If so, check the driving records of all drivers. Keep a structured schedule where all kids and adults are accounted for. No adult should dress, undress, bathe, or shower with children.
If I hire a teacher and I am talking to this teacher and I tell her that we in this school have a policy that we're open, there is no secrecy, there's no privacy in the relationship, the children, we are aware of sexual abuse, we are aware of problematic behavior, we will stop that before it happens. By saying that and letting the employee know that you have an organization that is completely aware of that and is set up and has preventative measures for that, the sexual offender is less likely to act out in this organization. They'll go find someplace else that doesn't have this kind of atmosphere.
Out-of-program contact restrictions. Your organization should limit contact between adults and youth to organize sanctioned activities and programs and to certain locations, such as activities within your organization's building.
A lot of parents have that false sense of trust and security. Oh, it's the youth minister. They're just talking to the minister. Who are you chatting with? The minister. Who are you texting with? Oh, the minister. You know what? That's not okay. It still needs to be monitored. It could be harmless, absolutely, and of course we hope that it is. But it could also be a grooming process.
Develop a system for monitoring the comings and goings of all youth and adults who enter and leave your facility. The system might include procedures for signing in and out. Develop specific policies about interactions between youth and people not affiliated with your organization if your activities take place in public areas, such as a sports field or any sponsored outside activity. Reporting child abuse is not pleasant, especially when it involves the children of a relative, neighbor, friend, or a coworker. However, the worst thing you can do is nothing. If you fail to act, remember that the abuse or neglect the child may be experiencing will likely continue.
So when you talk to kids and you're concerned that maybe somebody might be abusing them or they've been abused, it's very difficult, to find the right things to say. How do you address it with that child? So Sometimes if you find a physical injury on a child that you're kind of concerned about, or let's say they have a broken bone and you're wondering, what happened? How did you get that broken bone? It's reasonable, especially if you have a relationship with that child, to say, I noticed that you have this bruise or this mark on your arm, and I was just curious to know, how did you get that bruise on your mark on your arm? And then if they say something, you can ask a focused kind of question, and then if they give you a response that makes you a little bit more concerned, it's best to ask more open-ended questions then after that. So, if somebody says, so-and-so hit me, they say, well, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
If you suspect abuse, you must call the local Child Protective Services Agency or Department of Human Services.
All the way up to adolescence, children will test the waters to see how the caretakers will react. For instance, a child who is being maybe molested, let's give an example, by the janitor in the church at Sunday school, may tell mom or the Sunday school teacher, I don't like Mr. Brown. I don't like him. So they'll test out to see what happens. Oh, he's a nice man. There's nothing going to happen. Forget it. So the child will stop. So it's important to understand that children will come out with the story slowly. And then they may say, well, I don't like what he does, or he's not nice. Again, they're testing. And it's important that people who are in a position of trust and caring for children understand that this is what children are going to do to test your response. So it's important that you be open, non-judgmental, and very calm. If children see that you are, oh my, what happened? They'll stop talking about it. So children do test out, and we have to be savvy enough to know to know that this is the beginning, perhaps. And it may not. It may just be they don't like the janitor.
Gather accurate information. Every situation is different. In considering the most effective response that will ensure the child's safety and well-being, you will need to gather pertinent information and facts. Make notes. Record what you observe. Date and sign the entry. Continue to observe. Record what you observe and date and sign each entry.
The abuser has threatened them. They threaten them with, I will hurt your family, no one's going to believe you, you'll be taken to a home, you'll be taken out of your family. I've heard that often. So children are terrified, and it's going to be very important for the caretakers of children to establish an atmosphere that is non-judgmental and open in communication, and that children know that under no circumstances should people touch their privates or do anything to their body, and if it happens, that they can come and talk to them and that you will be there.
Develop action plans based on procedures. Familiarize yourself with your organization's procedures and processes.
If you suspect something's going on with the child, chances are if you question them, they're going to say there's nothing going on. But don't give up. If you really have this feeling, or you've seen something, or you can't put your finger on it, don't give up the first time.
Talk to other agencies about helping the family. Collaborate with or engage family support services, community health services, local government services, regional Department of Human Services, and Child Protection. Talk to the child. Do this with respect for the child's need for privacy and confidentiality.
Disclosure of abuse and/or neglect is definitely a process. A lot of times kids will test the waters by giving a little bit of a disclosure and kind of seeing how parents or other adults that they've disclosed to react or respond to that disclosure. And if they feel like that adult isn't ready to hear that, and that adult kind of shuts down or maybe gets upset, whether that's angry or sad, kids will frequently then shut down themselves and not continue to give a disclosure.
State reporting requirements and mandates. 32 states require only professionals such as teachers and doctors to report child abuse, but 18 require any adult who knows of or reasonably suspects child abuse to report. Primary and secondary school teachers and principals, film processors, doctors, nurses, and police are often referred to as mandated reporters. In 26 states, clergy are mandated reporters. They're required by law to report abuse suspicions.
You can do many different things. You can call your local police department, sheriff's office. The task force that I'm a part of is across the entire United States. You can also go to NCMEC, and NCMEC is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And they are the mecca of information. There's parent portals on there so parents can get information. There is training. There's so many different things on there. And parents think missing and endangered, my kid's right here. That's not the point. Take out the missing, let's go to the endangered. If your child is unsupervised online, they're probably endangered.
The responsibilities of a mandated reporter include: you are legally obliged to make a report to the Child Protection Service if you believe on reasonable grounds that a child is in need of protection. You must make a report without delay. You are required to make a report each time you become aware of any further grounds for your belief. You don't have to prove that the abuse has occurred. It is your responsibility to report your belief. It is not the responsibility of your boss, supervisor, principal, or senior. In instances where the supervisor of a mandated reporter directs them not to make a report, even where they believe abuse is occurring, they're legally required to make a report anyway. Mandatory reporting requirements take precedence over professional codes of practice where confidentiality or client privilege is claimed. A report does not constitute unprofessional conduct or a breach of professional ethics, nor does it subject the person to any liability if made in good faith.
Anybody can make a report to Child Protective Services. You don't have to be a mandated reporter to make a report. All you need is a reasonable cause to suspect that a child may be abused and or neglected.
Failure to report is serious. Approximately 47 states impose penalties on mandatory reporters who knowingly or willfully fail to make a report when they suspect that a child is being abused or neglected. Failure to report is classified as a misdemeanor in 39 states. In Arizona, Florida, and Minnesota, misdemeanors are upgraded to felonies for failure to report more serious situations, while in Illinois and Guam, second or subsequent violations are classified as felonies.
We interviewed the 13-year-old girl who was cutting herself, no self-worth, defiant, just really hard to handle, and interviewed her, and she swore there was no sexual relationship with her and her stepdad. And within 10 minutes of being on the computer doing a forensic review, there were hundreds of videos. It had been happening since she was 3, up until I think the last time was 2 days before we hit it with the search warrant. Luckily he pled guilty and he did not take it to trial, and she was a new person. She wasn't wearing black, her hair wasn't dyed, she stopped cutting, she didn't have on all the makeup, and she said she was freed from this prison.
Test your knowledge. 1. Can children under the age of 16 sexually abuse other children? A. Yes. B. No. 2. Social networking sites are an easy place for predators to access kids. Based on current research, why do teens flock to Facebook? A. Because they can share pictures with their friends. B. Because it's mainly a parent-free space. C. Because they can talk about their favorite sports. 3. Sleepaway camps should implement these safety measures. A. Background check on all staff and volunteers. B. Keep a structured schedule where all kids and adults are accounted for. C. Both A and B. End of part 4.
We as adults in position of trust with children have to arm ourselves with this knowledge. It's critical that we do and that we understand that. And that, I think, is major in the prevention of sexual abuse.
A pedophile is the most dangerous of all predators. They accumulate the greatest number of victims and are often habitual offenders. What's most disturbing is that they have a sexual preference for children, and they use positions of trust to have easy access to kids over and over again. They may be able to have some form of relationship with you, but sadly, it's your child they're after. Most of your staff and volunteers would never dream of hurting a child, but there are some who will. and who do. Even today, there could be a member of your organization who has poisoned thoughts of children. It is that person who needs to be identified and swiftly taken away from the kids whom he or she may be preying on.
Many of these organizations, such as churches, even schools, have volunteers, particularly the nonprofit organizations, that they welcome volunteers. However, a sexual predator can slip through that door very easy as a volunteer. So it's important that even with volunteers, that there are background checks that are conducted.
Don't let the innocent be heinously victimized. As caring, responsible individuals, we grieve for the enormous injury and for the losses experienced by the child who's been abused. Move beyond the grief and move into action. Efforts must be taken to keep children safe. Knowledge and ongoing education will help you make the right decisions.
People use the term kiddie porn. It's not a ride at an amusement park. It's not the toy section in the grocery store. It is child pornography. It is child sex abuse. When you use that term, kiddie pornography, it's very degrading to the victims who are survivors of this abuse. So if you're ever privileged enough to be in their presence, I would actually hate for you to use that word in front of them, because it's degrading, and it makes it sound like it was something fun that they endured, and it's not.
If by chance the subject matter of this material has brought up emotional trauma or memories of previous abuse, and you feel that you need support, please talk to a trusted friend, a psychologist, or a counselor at your place of worship. Perhaps there is a need for individual or family counseling. We realize that some people may be reminded of their own abuse memories and may still need some healing.
Congratulations! You viewed this video teaching tool in its completion. You will now be directed to a 20-question test. To pass, you must receive an 80% or better to receive Safeguard from Abuse certification. This test should take about 10 minutes to complete, and then print out your certificate. If you do not pass, you will have the chance to view this video presentation again and then retest. Thank you for being part of the solution.